So in this video, I'll be talking about hoisting, which is one of the most important questions, a must ask question in every interview. So every JavaScript interview has contains this question, no matter how big or small a company is. Alright, so what is hoisting? So people generally understand hoisting as a behavior by which a variable declaration or a functional function declaration can be moved to the top of the scope. So let me give you an example. I'll break it down and see how this happens in JavaScript. So I have declared a function print name, which is basically printing full name. In the fifth line, I have initialized and I have declared and initialized the variable full name. So you will see the difference how hoisting works. So in this case, if I run this code, what do you think will be the result? So if you, with your observation, you will say it will give us an error because we are basically trying to print out the variable, but in this scope there is no full name till the fourth line. It is declared on the fifth line. Let me run this. Okay, let me clear the console. Now I'll run the script. Node hoisting.js. Okay, so we get undefined as an output. So on this line, the full name contains undefined. The code didn't give us any kind of error, which it should give. If you have worked in other programming languages, you would have seen that before declaring and initializing a variable, you cannot access it. But here things are different. What basically is happening with this line, which says variable or functional declaration. So this is our variable declaration. This you can see, you can write the code. I'll break the code. You will see this now. Variable full name and this. Basically the code which you were seeing before is running like this. The line, the declaration, the variable declaration, I am declaring a variable. This variable declaration, when I declared here, it moved to the top, which basically means it gets prioritize it gets importance before anything else. Whenever we declare a variable without initializing its value in JavaScript, we by default assign undefined to such a variable. Remember, whenever we are not initializing a variable in JavaScript, we basically give that variable a default value undefined. Now you you can understand this. Why that basically you will get full name as undefined, because with variable declaration you get a default value undefined, which after which this line of code uh, run basically ran. What happened? Undefined gets printed. In the next line, full name is assigned to full name got a value case 12, the string. Why this happens? Why is this important to note? So we'll break it now. Why this happens? So whenever you are working with JavaScript, whenever you are executing some JavaScript code, there are things which are happening behind the scenes. So whenever uh, we run JavaScript code, we create a global execution context. A space, called it a container or a space, where your JavaScript code basically uh, gets memory allocated and each line of your code runs there. Okay, in this container, two things happens. The very first thing is memory declaration, or yeah, memory creation, you can call it. To be more precise, what happens basically, your variable declaration and function declaration gets memory allocation. So when you run this piece of code, what happens basically, the declaration is prioritized. So this line where full name, out of this the declaration part got the importance, and this part basically used in memory creation phase, and it gets a default value of undefined. Okay, in the second phase basically code execution happens. Code execution, which means we run code line by line. So now look what happens in the first phase, where full name gets a value undefined. Okay, now we'll run the code line by line. Console.log full name. What is the value of full name? Undefined. It gets printed. After that, the next line comes, full name is equal to case12. Okay, so full name now contains case12. You can add a log here as well, and now you can print out this piece of code again. You will see undefined case12. Okay, so basically what happens, a global execution context got created, okay, where two things happen. The very first thing is the memory creation phase, in which the memory gets allocated to various variables and variable declaration or function declaration. In case of variables got a value of undefined, but in case of function, the whole function gets stored. What do I mean by that is, you have seen example of a variable, right? Now I'll basically comment out this line. Oh, let me give you an example with the help of a function. Let's say I'm declaring a function, great. Okay, and this I'm basically saying good morning. Okay. Now I'll call greet method before its declaration. Now you will see the hoisting with the function. What happens with the function? Now I'll run this. We are calling the function before it gets declared. So with our understanding, without the understanding of hoisting, we will say that it will give us error. Same with the previous example. Without the knowledge of hoisting, we'll say the variable will calling the variable before its declaration will give us error. Now let me print this. Okay. Good morning. It works fine. The code works fine. So what happened? The in the global execution context get created. Okay, inside that two things happen. Okay, one more thing to note, there is a global execution context inside which you can have local execution context as well. Okay, so you can have the containers, various execution containers inside, nested inside each other. So basically this whole file hoisting.js, this is a scope of global execution context. Inside this print name is a local. It will have its own execution context, which is a local execution context. Okay. Now in this execution context, the very first thing which happened is memory creation. Memory gets allocated to the variables and the functions. So when we call this print name, it instead of prioritizing this, it prioritized the function, the memory allocation for this function. So what happened? This gets stored in the memory. It gets memory allocation. After that, code execution happened. And since this is already stored inside the memory, this would work fine. This will work fine because it is inside the scope stored in the memory. Now, when I say the whole function gets stored, that means in case of variable we were storing undefined, but in case of this function we are basically storing the whole function. Let me give you an example through which you can understand. I'm consoling log the function greet. Let's see This is our function. I'm consoling log. Now what will happen? Observe this. We got function greet. It basically indicates this contains a function greet. It also indicates that the whole function is copied to our memory directly. So this is how hoisting works. This is the working behind hoisting, and these are the examples with the help of which you can tell the interviewer about hoisting. It will help them understand better, and this will give them in-depth idea of hoisting. So now let me point out one more case which you should know, that I was using var full name. If I'll use let instead of a var, what will happen? What is going to happen in that case? Okay, I'll tell you about something called temporal dead zone. So you can get a question that do let and const variable get hoisted. Let me use a let variable full name. I am case 12. Now let me do the same. Console.log full name. Okay, now I'll run this. Okay, I'm using now let declaration for our variable. Now what will happen if I run this? Node hosting.js. Oh, we got an error. Cannot access full name before initialization. With the help of let, what happens? It followed a criteria. Basically, the full name which we were able to access previously is not accessible when I declared it with the let. Let me declare it with const as well. Let me run. Again, same error. Cannot access full name before initialization. It basically means that you cannot basically access the variable before its initialization. If you have not initialized a let or a const variable, you will get an error. So why this happens? Do these variable do this variable do not get hoisted? No, it's not the case. The very basic thing which differentiate var with these two is that there is something called temporal dead zone, which is basically uh, if I tell you the space where your var variable declaration is stored is different from the space where let and const variables are stored. They don't get any value like undefined initialized. They don't get initialized. They get memory allocation. they get hoisted, but they are not available to be accessed by the user before they get initialized. In case of const, you have to initialize immediately on the same line. You cannot, in this case, you cannot call it before its declaration and initialization. That's not possible. This basically helps us prevent various kinds of error as well. In the previous case, it was creating confusion with where it was creating confusion for the developer and for anybody who has worked in some other kind of programming language. That's not a behavior which is common. So the time period where basically the time period in case of let and const, variable declaration, and initialization, the time period between the declaration and initialization is called temporal dead zone. In this temporal dead zone case, we will not be able to access let variable or a const variable. This is refers as temporal dead zone. So in case of your basically in case of let and const, whenever people ask you this question, do they get hoisted? The answer is yes, they get hoisted, but due to temporal dead zone, we will still not able to access these let and const declarations declared variables before we initialize them. So this was all about hoisting. I have talked about hoisting. I have given you example with the help of variable hoisting and functional hoisting, functional declaration hoisting. Now we have also seen something called temporal dead zone. Okay, and we have also talked about let and const. Do they get hoisted? So this was all in this video. In next video, we'll talk about closures, which is also important for interview perspective. Thank you.